Hello, I'm Robert Moynihan in a cafe in Rome, Italy, just next to the Vatican, where I've just come out of the Vatican Library. We have with us the very esteemed Christopher Ferrara and Matt Gaspers. We're working together with Matt. And this podcast, coming to you on Thursday, October 15th, is going to focus on some of the great problems we're facing in our society today. Uh, Greetings to all. We've already got people watching us from New York, from Louisiana, from Slovenia, and other countries. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll try to answer your questions as we proceed forward. Matt, over to you.
Yes, so I'm very excited to have Chris Ferrara with us today. I've known Chris, gotten to know him over the past about 7 years or so. Our first correspondence through email was actually thanks to Inside the Vatican magazine. As I've mentioned before, I think it was in like the August, September issue of 2011, if I'm remembering correctly, that Bob, you mentioned in your editorial that Archbishop Pietro Sambi, the late Archbishop Apostolic Nuncio to the United States, um, just before Archbishop Vigano started his tenure, recommended a book to you, none other than Chris Ferrara's The Secret Still Hidden, which we'll be discussing today. Today's program is called Are We Living in the Third Secret of Fatima? And Chris Ferrara is one of the world's experts, I think, on the Third Secret of Fatima. He did many years of work with the late great Father Nicholas Gruner at the Fatima Center. He was also a close friend and associate of John Venari from Catholic Family News. So, Chris, we're very pleased to have you with us today.
It's a privilege to be on this forum. It's quite an honor, actually. So thank you for the invitation.
Absolutely. So today we are going to be discussing, as I mentioned, the Secret of Fatima, the third part of the secret, which is typically known as the third secret. I do have a few slides prepared for today, just for some visual aids for those watching. Thank you to everyone joining us. And really, our discussion today is going to center around the words spoken by the Immaculate Virgin Mary to these three children in the year 1917. And from right to left, we'll go from oldest to youngest. We have Lucia dos Santos, who was 10 years old when this picture was taken, and then her two younger cousins, Francisco and Jacinta Marto, who were 8 and 7, respectively, when this picture was taken. And the first thing that strikes me about the photo is their seriousness, the gravity. And that's obvious. The message that they were given was not really one of, I mean, they were given, Our Lady did give them great consolations at the beginning, but she shared with them some very intense things, certainly for any someone of any age, but certainly of their age, children their age. So let's see, how would you like to begin the conversation, Bob? Yeah, I do have a slide. I think the next slide is specifically so that people know exactly what we're talking about. People are probably familiar with this. This is the Secret of Fatima, and this is the first two parts here on the screen. Maybe I should just read through this, and then Chris can give some commentary on it based on what he's written about in his research. Does that sound good?
Or I could summarize because we know in the first two parts of The Great Secret, there is a prophecy that World War I will end soon. That was an apocalyptic event, which resulted in the end of the remnants of Christian civilization with the fall of the Habsburg Empire. And then she said that if people do not amend their ways, a greater war will come to pass. Russia will spread its errors throughout the world. We have Pius XI lamenting precisely that development in his encyclical on communism. But that in the end, her Immaculate Heart will triumph. However, failing the consecration of Russia, various nations will be annihilated. So that's the great secret in its essence. But then, as if to give us an indication of the third secret of Fatima, the third part, we have in the fourth memoir, this edition, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc. So we see here an indication of a crisis, a dogmatic crisis in the church, as to which there would not be such a crisis in Portugal. So we're talking about a dogmatic crisis. Anyone who's ever read The Secret and was disposed to reveal its essence, has indicated this is a crisis in the church that will reach the apex of the church. The apostasy will begin at the top, said Monsignor Ciappi, who was the papal theologian to a series of popes. So we're talking about a crisis in the church which will be accompanied by a crisis in the world. How do we know that it will be a global crisis as well? Because in 2000, the Vatican published the visional aspect of the third secret without the words of the Virgin. It's a film without a soundtrack. And what do we see? We see a devastated city. We see a pope barely escaping with his life as he limps past a city filled with cadavers. He goes to the top of a hill. He kneels in prayer before a cork bark cross, a cross made of cork bark trees. And at that place, he is assassinated by a bunch of soldiers who fire bullets and arrows at him. That, to me, it's a post-apocalyptic scenario in which all kinds of weapons have been gathered together by the survivors, including crossbows and guns. It's a very specific detail. And the Pope is executed. Now, Pius X had a vision that one of his successors would escape Rome and die in retirement, an ignominious death in retirement. So we see a twin chastisement of the church and the world, all indicated by this entree, this beginning of the third secret of Fatima in the fourth memoir.
Yes, it's very, very impressive. Very. I have this image on the screen here. It's kind of an artist depiction of what was happening. And I think the other interesting detail we have here. Hang on, I'm just trying to get Bob's microphone working here. Is that we have, it says a bishop dressed in white, and it almost looks like the text is like there's kind of spliced together as if it's not really a complete sentence, because it has a bishop dressed in white, and then this is from the Vatican's website. In quotes, it says, "We had the impression that it was the Holy Father." So we're not exactly clear who is speaking there. It's very, very odd.
This is what the Vatican published on June 26, 2000. Again, it's the vision, which is, as I say, a film without a soundtrack. Now, the Virgin has something to say about every other aspect of the message, including hell, which was obviously hell. The visionaries knew that they were looking at hell, and yet she said, "You have seen hell, where the souls of poor sinners go." But as to this enigmatic vision, not a single word of the Virgin by way of explanation has been published. So that is a very conspicuous omission. And, to me, the most decisive proof that something has been withheld is that the Vatican relied on Cardinal Sodano, a Vatican prelate immersed in corruption, to provide a non-binding interpretation of the secret, which according to him just depicts events in the 20th century that had already transpired. So according to Cardinal Sodano, the third secret is basically the second secret, which is ludicrous. So the mere fact that they had to resort to him to interpret the secret indicates something is missing, because there's no possible scenario in which the Mother of God would have left it to Cardinal Sodano to tell us what the third secret means.
Right.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So there's about 7 points that I think we should clarify, and I think the viewers will appreciate it. First of all, let's get it chronologically set. It's 107 years from 1917 to 2024. We are speaking in 2024. 2017 would be 100 years. 17 to 24 is 7 more years. 107 years are passed by. So this is just a little over 100 years ago, but my father was born in 1926. Pope Benedict was born in 1927. So just before our parents, in a sense, were born, this occurred. It was at the end of the First World War. We call it the First World War as the first time the whole world went to war. It's a vision of 3 children. There are some mysterious things about it, and the church never tells us that we have to believe these visions, that we are sort of bound by faith to believe that somehow God or the Holy Spirit or the Virgin Mary has spoken to us through these visionaries. Nevertheless, because there were events that occurred, and above all, the event that occurred on October 13th, 1917, which is just 2 days ago, we are October 15th now, so 107 years and 2 days ago, there were 70,000 people who they'd increased in number each month. The children had the vision on the 13th of each month, starting in May, June, July, August. It was shifted to the 19th because the children were put in prison by the local mayor who hated this idea of visions and the Virgin Mary. He was a communist. September 13th, October 13th. But because 70,000 people showed up and looked at the sky and said, the sun is moving, something very strange is happening, it's thought by people, even though the church still doesn't say this is absolutely declared to be of faith. We don't say that about apparitions. Nevertheless, we do say it's worthy of belief because there was an external factor that testified to it in 70,000 witnesses. Mm-hmm. Would you agree with that, both Matt and Christopher?
Sure, because we have here the first pre-announced miracle in salvation history. Our Lady said that at precisely solar time, noon solar time, on the date of the miracle of the sun, that there would be a miracle, a manifestation that would convince even the skeptics that the contents of the great message revealed on July 13, 1917 were authentic. And that's why 70,000 people were there. And they saw the miracle as promised at precisely the time pre-announced. And we know that Fatima is a world historical event. That may seem like a trivial confirmation of this, but Warner Brothers made a movie about this miracle. Miracle of Our Lady of Fatima. And it was even an Oscar nomination for
and
the
here's
soundtrack.
there's another important detail from one of our folks in the live chat. So drenched in rain, everything miraculously dry. That's another crucial detail, that the night before there had been a torrential rain, and the apparitions took place in this big field, the Cova de Iria, and it was, people were walking, ankle deep in mud. And at the end of this apparition, where the sun danced in the sky as it was described for around 10 to 12 minutes, and then looked like it was plummeting towards the earth, everybody thought it was the end of the world. They were going to be incinerated. The sun went back to its regular place in the sky, and everybody realized they were all dry and they were clean, whereas before they had been soaked to the bone and all muddy and dirty.
Right.
So,
and the poet laureate of Portugal, who was about 20 kilometers distant from the site of the apparitions, saw the miracle from his veranda.
Yeah.
So even though it was a localized phenomenon, but it was nonetheless miraculous in that it defied the laws of nature.
Yeah, and so temporally speaking, 107 years have passed by. The words have been conveyed to us almost entirely through Sister Lucia. And both Francisco and Jacinta died within a couple of years, still as children. And Lucia died in 2005, just a few weeks before John Paul II himself died. Most of us remember that year. But she died in February. I met with Cardinal Ratzinger in March. I then went to Portugal and went to the cell of Sister Lucia. He gave me permission to do so. And I looked at her bedside where she died, in her cell with the Mother Superior. There were lemon trees outside the window. And I said, could I look through the desk drawer? And I was able to do that. And wow. I thought I might find an old diary or some parts of the secret might be explained. But naturally, they were already, 3 weeks had already passed. And I do think, I've read that some of her writings were collected after her death. But in any case, I found this little leather case. And I thought, aha, finally. And I opened it up, and there were needle and thread. And she had used it to make rosaries. And I started to believe, in a certain sense, that whatever we seek for, and we can always look after messages and prophecies, but finally the rosary, or finally, let's say, the prayer which takes us out of ourselves, makes us less egocentric, slowly transforms ourselves into that light, which we were intended to be. We fall, in a sense, into darkness, and the world has fallen into sin, and which is why we see wars going on, people being abused, people being enslaved, addicted, and so forth. So this battle did involve these children, and I have a tremendous devotion to Jacinta in particular, because she used to eat berries when they weren't yet ripe. And she said, I'm doing it because they're bitter. And I was always wondering why. And I myself, when I was a little boy, sometimes would pick blueberries, and the blueberries were delicious when they were ripe, but there would be a little green one. And I would say, like Jacinta, I'm going to pick the green one and have that sour taste. And I'd say, that's quite bitter, but I'll offer it up. That's what Jacinta did. And I also had the chance, years before, I visited with a great devotee of Fatima, who was he was Antonio de Heredia. He was from one of the noble families of Portugal, related to Dom Duarte, who's related to the king, the royal line of Portugal. And Antonio took me to the hospital where Jacinta died, and I sat by the bed where she is said to have a final vision of the Virgin, a little bit like Rue de Bac in 1830. But I was deeply moved to be in the hospital room where Jacinta died. And I made a commitment, in a sense, to always try to be open and fair to anything regarding these messages, without ever falling into a too excited position or a too fideistic position. I wanted to use my mind and try to understand the importance of this. And that leads us to the second point. These children, I don't think, knew what Russia was. And the fact that they use a word, it's not too common in visions that there's an actual country named. And yet Russia was, in that time, just about to go through its Russian Revolution, 1917. As that October 13th miracle occurred, Lenin was gathering the Bolsheviks for an overthrow of the regime. And that remained for 70 years an atheistic, the first country in the world ever fully atheistic, but it had been the Holy Russia. It had been a Christian country. So I've always been fascinated by this, and I'll have to add in, you can come back with anything that I've said, but the American ambassador to the Vatican in the 1980s was Frank Shakespeare, and he was a close friend of Bill Casey, who was the head of our CIA. And I interviewed him when I was about 30 years old, and he had pity on me, and he took me under his wing and tried to explain to me what American policy was toward the Vatican, toward John Paul II, toward Gorbachev, to the fall of the Soviet Union. And he said the miracle of Fatima was extremely important to him. He was a Catholic. And he said the American government has been trying to understand the ramifications of these prophecies, even at the level of our intelligence services. And the communists also said the same thing. There's a man named Avro Manhattan, who was a communist. He wrote some books in the 50s into the 60s, and he said the West was manipulating this prophecy in an anti-Soviet key, trying to stir up public opinion against the communists. So this prophecy of these three holy children dropped into a world which was involved in great geopolitical conflicts between the West and the East, between the liberal democratic countries and the Soviet Union and the whole Eastern Europe, which after the Second World War fell behind the Iron Curtain. And in our lives, our whole childhood and early adulthood was spent under the divided Europe, the Iron Curtain. That disappeared around 1990. We've had 34 years, but now we're again on the vigil of perhaps a nuclear war. Pope Francis has told us we are already started World War III in pieces. And lastly, Pope Benedict said in the airplane in 2010, Fatima is not finished, which many had said it is finished. So I take it quite seriously that something related to Russia, to the conversion of Russia, which is said to be the victory of the Immaculate Heart of Mary, which is said to lead to a time of peace, is still in the cards.
I agree. Now, the fundamental warning here was that Russia would spread its errors throughout the world.
Yeah.
And that prophecy was promptly fulfilled. So we see Pius XI in 1937 in his encyclical on the errors of communism, Divini Redemptoris, lamenting the fact, and I'm quoting from the encyclical, how is it possible that such a system, long since rejected scientifically, and now proved erroneous by experience. How is it, we asked, that such a system could spread so rapidly in all parts of the world? So here he is speaking of the fulfillment of the very prophecy of the Virgin at Fatima, and Russia's errors have spread throughout the world. What do we mean by that? We mean divorce, abortion, contraception, the denial of the existence of an immortal soul, the way of life that looks to the things of this world only and sees nothing beyond this world, the materialistic, nihilistic social order that we now inhabit.
Man.
He was lamenting this in 1937 already.
So, Chris, you are really telling us the difference between the vision of blessedness that is provided by the faith, which is denied by materialism, by communism, by secularism. They say we cannot have that. They say that it's not real. But the misery that it opens us to, the addiction, the lack of any final eternal hope, is so drab, is so finally depressing, that what we are fighting for is the joy of humanity, the hope of humanity, the love of humanity. And yet we are in a corner, it seems, with trillions of dollars against us, with global media against us. So how can we three musketeers fight?
Well, Our Lady spoke of a very potent weapon, a weapon that has more than once changed the course of human history. And I mean, of course, the Holy Rosary. We know from the Battle of Lepanto that the Rosary was instrumental. From the Siege of Vienna, the Rosary was instrumental. From the mysterious departure of the Soviets from Eastern Austria, which historians to this day cannot explain.
Okay, explain that. I've heard that story, but explain precisely. People may not know about it.
There was a Rosary procession involving something like 1 million people in Austria. The prayer intention for that was that the Soviets would depart. And for
because
reasons
they stayed after 1945, also
Right.
in Austria, they didn't pull back. Austria
Right.
was under the Soviets. We forget that Austria was part of, for 10 years, from 45 to 55, of the
Right.
Soviet bloc. Yeah.
And after that Rosary procession, they got into their tanks and left. And I've seen a panel discussion where historians continued to speculate about why the Soviets would have done this. There really is no sensible explanation. It's not humanly explainable. So the Rosary is a key element by which not only we three musketeers, but the body of the faithful as a whole could change the course of history. You know, there's a bit of a news story, kind of a tidbit, but a very revealing tidbit. The Atlantic Monthly has just come out with an article linking the Rosary to AR-15s in the minds of so-called MAGA extremists, and expressing some reservations about the weaponization of the Rosary, as if with a kind of diabolical cunning. They understand that there's power in the Rosary. For them, it may only be a superstition. And this story was taken up on Fox News. So the Fox News panel was discussing the Rosary, and one of the panelists, Tom Shalhoub, is a devout Catholic. He prays the Rosary, and he starts talking about the prayer of St. Michael. St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and snares of the devil, on Fox News. And Kat Timpf, a really secularized ex-Catholic, begins reciting the prayer of St. Michael from memory as well on Fox News. So even the Atlantic recognizes, and this has always been the case since the Great Revolt of Martin Luther in 1517, that the last bulwark against the overthrow of the reign of Christ the King was and always will be the Catholic Church and the members of the mystical body and their prayers and sacrifices. That's how ultimately the victory will be given to the Lord of history, when all of these horrible things that menace us now are turned aside, and there will be this period of peace that you're talking about, Bob, before the end of time, which will involve, of course, the advent of the Antichrist.
Okay, I agree with you, and I would say a lot of us in our lives slip apart or away, even from our church, our parish, and even from saying the Rosary. We may say it as children, and decades may pass by, but I would encourage viewers to try it. Many of you, since you're watching us, may already be praying the Rosary, but it's somehow oh, here's Chesty Marine again. The rosary is likely the only thing holding back the complete wrath of God upon the world. Now that is quite a statement, because sometimes you would imagine he would be upset with what we do to each other, what we do to the unborn children, and we even sell their parts. This is seemingly a commercialization even beyond what anyone did for many centuries to make it into a business. And so God might say, this humanity has become so corrupt, it must be chastised, it must be punished. But the rosary does seem to focus on Christ. The mysteries are his coming into the world, which is the joyful mysteries. The Logos from eternity comes into time by being conceived and born of the Virgin Mary. And Christmas is at the center, the birthday. It's a happy time, the joyful mysteries. But then they're followed by the sorrowful mysteries, which is his passion, how he is arrested, betrayed, crowned with thorns, whipped, carries the cross, and dies. And so that's the middle mysteries. And then in the old 15 mystery system, the third is everything after that, leaving space and time, entering back to eternity, the resurrection, the ascension, the Holy Spirit comes, the assumption of the Virgin Mary, and the crowning of Mary as the Queen of Heaven, which is, so the rosary is Christocentric in the sense Jesus coming into the world, Jesus suffering, Jesus ascending into glory, the glorious mysteries. But this means you repeat the kind of repetitive prayer, which people criticize, but they're all scriptural passages, and they come to an end with now and at the hour of our death. And I was talking to a friend of mine here in Rome just yesterday. I said, she was saying, I did a talk about the rosary on a program for a radio station. And I mentioned there were only two times that matter, not yesterday, not tomorrow, but now, and that moment when we die, now and at the hour of our death. Those are the moments when we decide. And I wanted to share that because yesterday I said I've got to mention that on the podcast. Now and at the hour of our death. The idea of a meaningful, thoughtful, good death has been banished from our society. People are dying without any thought, or they're even drugged and they're not even conscious. But that death is our departure from this sort of exile. We call it our exile. Our kingdom, our home is eternal, beautiful, redeemed, forgiven, and glorified. Anyway, I think this is our faith.
So tie that back to the third sacred. If we're talking about a crisis, a dogmatic, doctrinal, disciplinary crisis in the church, we should look to John Paul II's interview, his book-length interview, Crossing the Threshold of Hope. There, he inadvertently admits that the crisis relates to precisely a loss of consciousness in the church of the four last things. That's judgment, heaven, and hell. And he says to Messori in this interview that since the Second Vatican Council, churchmen have lost the courage to preach the threat of hell, and that the eschatological vision of the four last things, we will die, we will be judged, we will be sent to heaven or hell, has been lost in favor of a kind of gauzy communal eschatological vision in which the people of God are on a pilgrimage toward salvation, and the sight of the individual soul is lost by preachers and catechists in the church. He admits all of this to Messori. So it's a state of confusion.
Or what Sister Lucia said, the diabolical disorientation, right?
We've lost focus on the things that matter, and the thing that matters most of all is eternity. And we talked about this before we went on air, this concept of eternity. You mentioned, Bob, a spark in us that exists eternally. And I would say I'm one of those who thinks that the folkloric concept of time really doesn't exist, that we are already in eternity, the now that remains, the nunc stans, and that will just be translated to a different state of existence. But right now, we are sempiternal beings. We have an eternal destiny. And we live in eternity, and our eternal fate will be determined by our correspondence to the graces that God gives us. This is what the message of Fatima is all about. And it's precisely that vision, that eschatological vision of the individual soul and its eternal destiny that John Paul II admits has been lost in the post-conciliar church. And now we see the church behaving more like a non-governmental organization, an NGO, than a vehicle for salvation.
I might say, not that it's been lost entirely, but maybe obscured.
Very much so.
Diminished. And do you see me? I've lost the picture now.
I can see you.
We can still see you, yeah. Bob, I wanted to make sure that we relate or bring up during this show, because Christopher talks about it in both of his books. Yeah. I have his books here. That's the first one is The Secret Still Hidden. And both of these are available from the Fatima Center. And then the other one is False Friends of Fatima. So I wanted to bring up and relate the message of Our Lady of Fatima to Our Lady of Akita from 1973. You and I had the privilege of interviewing a Japanese priest recently who knew Sister Agnes Sasagawa personally. She just passed away earlier this year. And here is the quote from the message of Our Lady of Akita from October 13th, the anniversary of Our Lady's final apparition at Fatima. And this is what she told Sister Agnes. As I told you, if men do not better themselves, the Heavenly Father will inflict a great punishment on all humanity. Before I go on, I just want to note, you'll notice here there's a temporal, like a physical chastisement mentioned, but then there's also a spiritual chastisement. And I think, as Chris points out in his books, the physical chastisement here certainly corresponds to what we saw in The Secret of Fatima about wars and persecutions of the church, everything we saw throughout the 20th century, and certainly going beyond that. But what's missing in the third part of The Secret is the words of Our Lady, such as we have here, talking about this spiritual chastisement, this crisis of faith in the church. So after Our Lady of Akita talks about fire falling from the sky and wiping out a large part of humanity, she goes on to say, the work of the devil will infiltrate even into the church. One will see cardinals opposing cardinals and bishops confronting other bishops, exactly like what we see today. The priests who venerate me will be scorned and condemned by their confreres. Churches and altars will be sacked. The church will be full of those who accept compromises. That also sounds very familiar. And the demon will tempt many priests and religious to leave the service of the Lord.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we recalled in, I forget, it was in the 1990s, I believe, Bob, that Howard D. confirmed to you, he was the former ambassador to the Vatican from the Philippines,
Yes.
who said that Cardinal Ratzinger personally confirmed to him that the message of Fatima and the message of Akita are one and the same, essentially.
Yes. Now, I can add something. Here in Rome, the other day at a press conference was a newly named cardinal. He will not become a cardinal until December 8th. He is from Tokyo. He is the Archbishop of Tokyo, and he's Japanese and quite impressive. Very intelligent man. He seems a faithful man. And we walked together after the press conference under the colonnade of St. Peter's Square toward the Holy Office. And I said, I did an interview with Onoda, and he said, he's a bit disobedient. And then I said, but what about these apparitions of Our Lady of Akita? He said, yes, I'm interested in them. There is no doubt that there were tears. He said that to me. It was just a conversation. We were walking. I don't have it tape recorded, but this picture shows it. And he says it's a mystery, and it's a kind of mystical mystery. This wooden statue wept 101 times. And what does weeping signify? Either of you?
Well, obviously, grief over the fate of the world. And there is a correspondence between the vision of the third secret revealed in 2000 and the message of Akita. In the vision revealed in 2000, we see that a city is devastated by flames emanating from the sword of an avenging angel. And then at Akita, we hear that fire will rain down from the heavens, destroying a great part of humanity, leaving the survivors in envy of the dead. So there is a direct
Yes.
correspondence between the two visions. And the two visions also relate a crisis in the church to this global chastisement. So the correspondence between the two is quite uncanny. By the way, I went to Akita. I did meet Sister Sasagawa. She actually had been housed by a rich Japanese in a Japanese suburb somewhere at that time. She wasn't allowed to speak about the apparitions. So
Well, wait. Did you or did you not meet her?
I did meet her. We had lunch, in fact, and she was
Christopher.
quite spry at that time. I think she was in her mid-70s at that time, and
You
she
probably
would not speak of the apparitions, though.
You probably also met the priest that Bob and I interviewed about a month ago, Father Thomas Anoda. He probably was there.
He was there, and Father Couture was there.
Oh, okay, good.
All right. So we
I
are
met-
tracking all these things down, and what we've done just in this program so far, we talked about the overarching message, we talked about the time frame, we talked about the rosary. Now I would like you to go through why there's a mystery about what the contents are. And I think we can explain it fairly clearly to readers, and we can take it all the way up to Sambi, who I did speak with. Archbishop Sambi took the time to meet with me in the nunciature in Washington, D.C. And what was the date of that, Matt?
You published that editorial, I believe, in the August-September issue of 2011. I had a hard copy of it, but I gave it to Chris as a gift because I figured he'd like to have that.
So it was 2011, or it might have been a little earlier. I have to check, because he died that summer of 2011.
Yeah, it was right after his death. I think it was called, your editorial was the passing of a friend, something like that.
Well, I mentioned to him that you had questions about the total publication of the message of Fatima. You said something had been left out. And I said, I probably shouldn't bring this up with you, a Vatican official, because the Vatican Secretary of State, who is your boss, Cardinal Bertone, has probably settled this question by saying we did publish everything, and I would put you in an awkward position. He said, no, excuse me for a moment. He got up, he went to his office, he came back, held your book up, and he said, I find this book very interesting, and I think it's worth reading, which meant that your points were things that he, as a top church official, was thinking about himself. That something somehow was missing in the message.
We have this comment. I think that is a good springboard for this next segment of our discussion. Someone has said, Dr. Moynihan, can you comment on your conversation with Archbishop Capovilla, indicating a second envelope of the third secret of Fatima? And incidentally, Chris was instrumental. He took a leading role in a very famous debate that took place in May. It was May of 2010, right before Benedict went to Fatima. And some people think that debate with, what was his name? De Carli?
Giuseppe De Carli.
Yeah.
That's right. He was a famous Vaticanist.
This debate happened in Rome, and some people think that debate and the fact that De Carli ultimately ended up admitting something like, well, maybe I was deceived about the contents of the third secret, that led Benedict to say what he did in May of 2010. I'll let Chris take it from there.
Well, I'll just comment also myself. This love of wisdom, and I'm very appreciative that your name is a lover of wisdom. That would be...
oh, yeah.
Well, really, that's the word philosopher. Right, Chris?
Yes.
Philosophia, we call it in Italian. Sophia is wisdom in Greek, and philo is love. So philosophy is the love of wisdom. And the wisdom ultimately is connected with the divine, connected with God, the truly wise. And so the lover of wisdom should be and is, I think, a lover of God. And the person is asking me, I went 2 times to talk with Loris Capovilla, which is kind of another mystery of my own life, which I can't explain. You all can think that it's either coincidence or maybe providence, but he lived to be, I believe, maybe Matt, you could check this, Loris Capovilla. I think he lived to 105. He was the secretary of John the 23rd. By rights, I never should have met him alive. In other words, he kept living and living and living. And finally, I said to myself, I got to talk to the man. And because Malachi Martin had said he had knowledge of what happened in 1959 when the secret wasn't opened by John the 23rd, and that he himself may have read the secret, etc. I said, well, I'll try to interview Loris Capovilla, and he agreed. So I went up to northern Italy, and Loris Capovilla was living in a residence near Sotto il Monte, which is a tiny little village, not too far from Bergamo, Italy, not too far from Milan, northern Italy. And Sotto il Monte was where John the 23rd was born. He was a poor child, a poor family, a large family. And the residence of his secretary, Loris Capovilla, was nearby. And I drove the car up. They said, welcome. His assistant came to the door. He says, I think at that time, he might have been an archbishop. He was made a cardinal towards the end of his life. And I said, let's talk about the third secret of Fatima, among other things. We did talk about the pontificate of John the 23rd, what type of man he was, etc. But the third secret, he did say that, I said, Tarcisio Bertone, the Secretary of State, has held up the envelope on television. And I think we have somewhere a picture of that, Matt. We showed it on another podcast. And he said, John the 23rd, in August of 1959, said, let's take a look at this message of Fatima. Get it from the archives or from the Doctrine of the Faith. I've never had that straight either. So where is that message today? I don't know. It's either in Doctrine of the Faith, or it's in the Vatican Secretary of State archives, or maybe it's in some other sui generis archive, because it was said for a while it was kept in the desk in the Pope's apartment. So that's a third place. The Holy Office, the Vatican Secretary of State, or the papal apartment.
And essentially what Chris explains in this book, and he can tell us more about it in The Secret Still Hidden, he demonstrates that there are definitely two distinct envelopes with two distinct texts. That's a big part of this book.
There's no question that there is a Capovilla envelope on the outside of which Capovilla wrote down the dictation of John the 23rd to the effect that he would leave it to his successors to interpret the contents. So that writing on the outside of that envelope sets that envelope apart from the one that was displayed on television by Bertone.
Okay, so that just to confirm.
What's that?
Yeah, just to confirm. I asked that question. I said, so John the 23rd said, let's put this envelope away. You write on it. I said, it's not for me. It'll go to my successor.
Right.
And I said, did you write on it? He said, yes, I wrote on it. And I said, but Tarcisio Bertone held up an envelope without your writing on it. And he said, maybe there were two envelopes. And he kind of smiled at me without solving the problem.
Wink, wink. Yeah.
Well, obviously there were two envelopes because.
And so that's what you carried forward with great precision as you really tried to figure out. And you can go ahead now.
Well, the book, The Secret Still Hidden, is basically a relentless forensic examination of all the discrepancies in the Vatican's account. It's online if you want to look at it. At the end, I summarize literally 101 reasons to doubt the official account of the Third Secret of Fatima. And the existence of the Capovilla envelope is just one of those proofs. And that's why I think Archbishop Sambi gave credence to the book, not because I'm such a great Fatima scholar, but because I have the legal skill to assemble evidence. And when you assemble the evidence, I resisted this conclusion, by the way. I resisted the conclusion that the Vatican was hiding something.
So you are...
and wanted to satisfy myself that this wasn't just a crazy conspiracy theory.
Sorry, Bob, you cut out a little bit, but yes, Christopher by trade is a lawyer. So he has, I think that's what Bob was asking.
And I didn't want to be the partisan of a conspiracy theory. So what I did was I set out to prove to myself that something was in fact amiss here, that there was a missing document. And that document, as I said at the beginning, has to be the Virgin's explanation of an enigmatic vision of a half-ruined city and a
Okay.
pope being executed. And we have
Okay,
yet
so
to see that
what you were
explanation.
saying, what you're saying is there's a vision that children say they saw a half-ruined. There's the suggestion that they heard an explanation of the vision, but there's no writing. It seems that there was that Lucy had that this is the explanation of that vision, and that does exist, but it's never been revealed. That's more or less what you're arguing, correct?
It has to be the case because, as I said at the outset, the mere fact that they had to rely upon a dubious interpretation by Cardinal Sodano of what the vision means that the vision on its face lacks an explanation. Now, how could it be that the Mother of God would provide this dramatic vision to the visionaries with no explanation, leaving it to Cardinal Sodano? That in itself, to me, is probative of the absence of a missing text that has been kept under lock and key. But again, in the fourth memoir, Sister Lucia wrote the beginning of that third part. In Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc. Curiously enough, when the Vatican published its official booklet regarding its publication of the vision only in 2000, it did not use the fourth memoir. It resorted to the third memoir instead of the fourth, even though Bertoni admitted the fourth memoir was a more complete document. And instead of relying on the fourth memoir with this telltale reference to what is obviously an explanation of the vision, in my view, they took that explanation from the fourth memoir and dropped it into a footnote and called it Annotations by Sister Lucia. No, it wasn't an annotation by Sister Lucia. It was a direct verbatim quotation of the Mother of God, who said to the visionaries, actually to Jacinta and Lucia, because Francisco couldn't hear, in Portugal, the dogma of the faith will always be preserved, etc., indicating the rest of the explanation. Now, the Vatican has been ducking that telltale etc. since 2000. When Bertoni was confronted with it, he said, in my opinion, it relates to the second part of the secret, meaning the prophecies about World War II, the spread of Russia's errors, and so forth. But that's curious because he had every opportunity to ask Sister Lucia what the etc. comprises. Now, obviously,
he had an interview. He had an interview with her.
Right,
several, many hours, right?
Yeah, 10 hours, he said, unrecorded, just his personal notes.
Yeah.
And either she
okay.
told him what it meant and he doesn't want us to know, or he didn't ask her because he knows what it means, having read this explanatory text himself, and did not want to ask her. But obviously something is fishy here because the etc. has never been explained satisfactorily by the Vatican.
Okay, so the reason this is important, if I could try to be very clear, many people believe that there is a text that Sister Lucy wrote saying that the Virgin told her there would be a terrible crisis of faith, that there might be an apostasy from the faith, even by the top leadership, and that was written down on a sheet of paper, I guess 25 lines long, and that has never been revealed. And they haven't revealed it according to this widespread sort of rumor that a lot of people believe, because it shows the leadership in a bad light. And therefore, once again, we've been talking with Father
Bob.
Murr about the Gagnon. You lost me?
Yeah, you're cutting in and out.
We've been saying that I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
We've been saying that the Gagnon report from the 70s should be released, right? You hear me?
Yes.
And we now are saying that this 25-line final part of the Secret of Fatima should be made public.
And I definitely want to put up on the screen what Benedict XVI said in May of 2010 when he went to Fatima. This was just days after that conference I mentioned where Chris Ferrara and others publicly debated Giuseppe De Carli, and he ultimately said, well, maybe you guys have it right and I have it wrong. So this is what Benedict said. There are two statements. One was on the way over on May 11th during the plane trip to Portugal, and he talks about realities, and he was asked specifically about the third secret in light of the sexual abuse crisis. That was the context of the question. And this is what is part of his answer. He said, beyond this great vision of the suffering of the Pope, talking about what was released in 2000, an indication is given of realities involving the future of the church. There is mention of, so he actually says, there is spoken, there are words, in other words, there is seen the need for a passion of the church. The new things which we can find in this message today, he said, involve the sufferings of the church come precisely from within the church, from the sin existing within the church. But we don't see anything about sin existing within the church and an internal crisis in what was released in 2000, right?
By the way, the Italian si illuderebbe is in the reflexive tense, means one would be deluded to think, not merely mistaken.
Correct.
So the English translation that the Vatican has provided is misleading.
Right. On May 13th,
Benedict said it's a delusion to think that Fatima's prophetic mission is complete. And here he speaks about an internal crisis in the church as bound up in the third secret of Fatima. So Antonio Socci has said that with this revelation, Benedict has reopened the dossier in what he calls, ironically, the fourth secret of Fatima, meaning the missing part of the third secret. And that, again, is the prediction of a crisis in the church that Benedict here openly reveals during his pilgrimage to Fatima. And by the way, that's another indication of how the Fatima apparitions are on a different level entirely from the so-called private apparitions. They have received a level of papal approbation without precedent in the history of apparitions. I mean, Pope after Pope has made a pilgrimage to Fatima in tribute to the vision, and John Paul II attributes Our Lady of Fatima to the salvation from the assassination attempt. Because at the moment the bullet was fired, he turned to look at an image of Our Lady of Fatima, and that turning of his upper body caused what would have been a fatal wound to be a survivable wound. And he took that bullet, went to Fatima on pilgrimage, and placed that bullet in the crown of Our Lady of Fatima. So there's no question that this so-called private apparition is on a different level. Father Gruner always called it a public prophetic revelation, not divine revelation, but a prophecy by a prophet. And who is the prophet? The Mother of God.
I remember he used to relate that to what St. Thomas says in the Summa about the nature of prophecy and its purpose, that it's not to reveal new information, but to direct human acts, something like that. I'm paraphrasing, but... Okay. And then I know that he also mentioned, and Chris, I've heard you say that at some point, John Paul II said publicly that the message of Fatima imposes an obligation on the church.
That's literally what he said.
Yeah.
So we've got 2 points to make very clear to the audience. The first point is that what is on the screen right now is in the words of Pope Benedict in 2010, 10 years after the secret was revealed in June of 2000. This is the part, we believe this is referring to what was not revealed in 2000. That this somehow is referring to some lines of text that Sister Lucy wrote that speak of a crisis within the church, even at the top of the church. And it's a type of a persecution that comes not from her enemies without, but arises from sin within the church. And Pope Benedict is speaking of this in a veiled way, as if actually he's revealing the secret, but in not saying it. And then he adds to it that bottom line, we would be mistaken, we would be deluded, si illuderebbe in Italian. We would be deluding ourselves to think that Fatima's prophetic mission is complete. So I've always felt from that day till today, that's now 14 years ago, but still I believe that somehow that idea that Russia would be converted, period of peace would be granted to the world, the Immaculate Heart would triumph, and also that the church would pass through a type of interior passion in which the greatest persecution of the church comes not from her enemies, without. I'm reading this, that yellow part, up from the bottom. That the greatest persecution of the church comes not from her enemies, without, who do exist, but arises from sin within the church.
And the sin and heresy and apostasy are obviously sins as well, not just sins against morals, but against the faith itself. I also wanted to put up on the screen, so we also know from our friend Micah Hickson over at LifeSite News. Let me take down this icon so we can see all of this here. So in 2016, she reported for 1 Peter 5, today on the Feast of Pentecost of that year, I called Father Ingo Dollinger, who died the following year, who unexpectedly confirmed to her over the phone the following facts. This is her summarizing the discussion. Not long after the June 2000 publication of the Third Secret of Fatima by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger told Father Dollinger during an in-person conversation that there is still a part of the third secret that they have not published. There is more than what we published, Ratzinger said. He also told Dollinger that the published part of the secret is authentic and that the unpublished part of the secret speaks about, quote, a bad council and a bad mass, end quote, that was to come in the near future. Father Dollinger gave me permission to publish these facts on this high feast of the Holy Ghost, and he gave me his blessing.
Well, we also know from the text you had up moments ago that in 2010, Pope Benedict revealed that the message of Fatima relates to future realities of the church, which are gradually becoming apparent. Mm-hmm. So even then, he was saying that we are watching the unfolding of something involved in the Third Secret of Fatima, as to which the Vatican made no disclosure in the year 2000. So he reopened the whole case for the existence of this missing text with this veiled reference. Now, in terms of the consecration of Russia, the consecration of Russia would have avoided these crises that we're seeing, the twin crisis of the church and the world. And yet, for some mysterious reason, although there have been many papal attempts to do a consecration of Russia, Russia has never been singled out as the sole object of the consecration, as if by some perverse inclination, people in the Vatican have simply refused to do that, lest Russia actually convert and rejoin the church, ending the schism of the Orthodox in a reunification with Rome. Here's what Francis said during his consecration. Everyone thought this was going to be, finally, the consecration of Russia, because Russia would finally be mentioned by name. But even here, we have a problem. So he ends up saying, therefore, Mother of God and our Mother, to your Immaculate Heart, we solemnly entrust and consecrate ourselves, the Church, and all humanity, especially Russia and Ukraine. That's not a consecration of Russia. I wanted to think that it was. I was optimistic about it. Mm-hmm. But obviously, given events in Russia and Ukraine, both of which are now involved in an all-out war, clearly that was not the consecration of Russia. Now, the ceremonies that have been done hitherto might have produced some benefit, as did the attempted consecration of Pius XII. Lucia said it was revealed to her that there would be some benefit from Pius XII's consecration. World War II would end. Mm-hmm. And there would be a period of peace following the war. And maybe we've received a partial benefit in terms of Russia's movement from Soviet communism to what we see now, which is basically an authoritarian regime in which at least the Russian Orthodox Church is allowed to exist. But the Catholic Church exists under severe restrictions. So that's a partial benefit. But we have yet to see what the conversion of Russia would finally entail, which is a reunification with Rome and the end of the Orthodox schism. That might come, said the great mystic and poet Soloviev, during a great war between the East and the West, as he predicted at the turn of the 20th century. There would be this reunification. And this is a secular savant, as it were, seeing in these events the ultimate resolution of the crisis in the world by a reunification of the Orthodox with Rome during a crisis, a war.
Mhm. Oh, Bob, you have to unmute yourself.
All right.
There you go.
Vladimir Soloviev is a very interesting figure. He was a Russian theologian, and he died in 1900. There is a rumor that he entered the Catholic Church on the day of his death.
Wouldn't be surprised.
But in any case, he also wrote, you can find it on the internet, the Tale of the Antichrist, which talks about the arrival of the Antichrist and how he will seem to be very kind and good and humane, but he will do anything except Jesus Christ. That's what will be forbidden. And that was recommended over the years repeatedly by Pope John Paul II, by Benedict, and even by Francis, to be, for us journalists, when we were at Trenta Giorni and when I've been doing the magazine, I've republished selections or even the entire piece by Soloviev several times over the years, just as I've republished The Lord of the World by Robert Hugh Benson.
By the way, Bob, I just noticed that according to EWTN, Soloviev actually made a profession of faith before an Eastern Catholic priest and was received into the church in 1896.
Oh, wow.
I can send you the link to that on the chat. So he
Sure.
did convert. So he, by his own personal example, he symbolized what would eventually be the culmination of the Fatima message with a reunification. Of
That's very that's very interesting, and
Yeah.
I think he's a brilliant writer, and we could probably have some programs about him, but at least suggest that people read Soloviev. He was talking about the necessity for the healing of the schism between the Catholics and the Orthodox, which dates from 1054, and unfortunately, it's going to be 1,000 years in 2054. I've spent the last 25 years trying to do whatever we could do by writing, by visiting Russia, etc., to see if there were any possibility of building bridges. And right now we're in a terrible war. And so for 2 years, I've been deeply saddened for each loss of life, for all the hatred, for the many, many Ukrainians who feel, the Russian bear is committing genocide, and but also even for the Russian soldiers who are just signed up and sent there by their leaders, and also because the West is just funneling infinite weapons there to keep the thing going and going and going. So I am in favor of a peace, but the fact is, the reunion of the Catholic and Orthodox churches seems very far off, but I still think that it must occur.
It will have to occur before the message is fulfilled. By the way, in terms of the consecration of Russia, Father Bruno always cited the historical example of the failure to consecrate France to the Sacred Heart of Jesus.
Mhm.
And that failure resulted in the ascendancy of the National Assembly and the loss of power by Louis XVI, 100 years to the day from the date that consecration of France to the Sacred Heart was requested. And now, what would be the 100th anniversary of the request of the consecration of Russia? Well, that came on June 13th, 1929, during the apparition to Sister Lucia, when Our Lady said, "The time has come for the consecration of Russia." So we have another 5 years to go.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. I didn't quite realize we don't date it from 1917, but from 1929.
That's right.
So, Matt, are we going to have a secret session now on Locals where we don't put it on YouTube, but people can actually talk with us, ask us questions? Is that what we're going to do, or?
Yes. So this first, the main podcast that was open to the general public, we called "Are We Living in the Third Secret of Fatima?" Which I think, based on all of what we've discussed, it's pretty clear that we certainly are. But in the next portion of the podcast, we're going to transition over to Locals, our Locals community, and it's still open to everybody. You just have to become a member of our Locals community. So let me put a link into our to where people can sign up and become a member, and then it'll just take us a few minutes to transition over. We'll end this current live stream and start a new one on locals, but here is the link to join our locals community.
Okay, so look in the chat for the link. Now, I should say, I don't even like to do this too much because I think we're going to lose people who say, what, I don't know how to do it, and we'll lose you. So I don't like to do it, but we've been advised we must build up a community. And if we do everything on YouTube, we won't have a sense of an intimate community that sort of has a kind of relationship, a kind of group that's being formed. We have, on my list, I see over 400 people are live and from many different countries. And I'm so grateful to all of them. We do recognize our own limitations. Some of the limitations are that technologically we are still getting the best technology, trying to understand it and use it. And we expect in the next months to be coming each week better. And Christopher, we really appreciate you coming on. I apologize, once or twice here, I was losing the internet. I'm actually in a cafe about 30 steps from the Vatican Wall, near where Cardinal Ratzinger used to live before he became Pope. I'm actually
I know the area.
Yeah, and I'm the only one in this part of the cafe, but someone keeps walking behind me to sweep up. And so, Matt, how is this going to work? And do we want to do anything for the people who are watching now who we might lose?
Yeah, well, I've put a link into our locals community a couple times now into the live chat. Before we wrap up this live stream, I did want to cover this very important quote that, as I understand it, Chris, you discovered this quote in a French book by a Monsignor Roche. I'm going to put this up on the screen. Yep, there it is. We just passed the anniversary of the death of Pius XII, who was Cardinal Eugenio Pacelli. And Chris has this quote, and he quotes this in both of his Fatima books, and I'll just read a little bit of it here. It says, "I am worried by the Blessed Virgin's messages to little Lucia of Fatima. The persistence of Mary about the dangers which menace the Church as a divine warning against the suicide of altering the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. I hear all around me innovators who wish to dismantle the sacred chapel, destroy the universal flame of the Church, reject her ornaments, and make her feel remorse for her historical past. A day will come," he said, "when the civilized world will deny its God, when the Church will doubt as Peter doubted." And I don't know if Chris wants to add anything further from the original French.
It's on page 52 to 53 of this book. I was accused of providing an apocryphal quote. Here it is in this book. It took me 6 months to find this.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing I would say about the translation is actually he uses the conditional tense, the suicide that would be represented by the alteration of the faith in her liturgy, her theology, and her soul. And that's what he said, according to this account. So he must have had access to some element of the Fatima message at that point. Probably the third secret.
Chris, you're a great researcher. We owe a lot to you to bring this quote into the general public sphere. Matt, why don't you finish reading it? The last few words are really important.
Yes.
So it goes on. He says, a day will come when the civilized world will deny its God, when the Church will doubt as Peter doubted. She will be tempted to believe that man has become God. Sounds a lot like transhumanism to me. In our churches, Christians will search in vain for the red lamp where God awaits them, obviously meaning the sanctuary lamp indicating the presence of our Lord in the tabernacle, the Blessed Sacrament. Like Mary Magdalene weeping before the empty tomb, they will ask, "Where have they taken him?" And in many modern post-Vatican II churches, they were designed to not have the tabernacle in the sanctuary where it belongs.
Now, I have to say, we have hundreds and thousands of faithful Catholics. We have priests who still, 110%, committed their lives to following Christ, the disciples of Christ. We've had a terrific assault, and we've had terrible abuse problems. And we've even had, we might call it infiltration of people who may have been not believers into the church, the whole Bella Dodd question. However, for us to reject the entire total church would be too radical.
Of course.
And so we need, I think we've been saying in the past few podcasts, we'd like people to consider dropping by their parish church and saying to the priest, I've had my doubts about the church or you, I've maybe departed from it, or I've doubted that it's maybe become, departed from the tradition and I don't want to engage in that, but I'd like to come back and support you in some way and give you of my faith and my support for our parish. And there could be a flame lit of a renewal in the church that would come from the type of sacrifice that the type of people watching this podcast would be making to try to return the visible church to the path of true discipleship. Is this wrong of me to say, either of you?
No, I think that's absolutely right. Absolutely
Maybe
right.
some of our readers may reject that. They'll say, we've got to make a judgment when it's necessary to say they've gone too far. We can't, participate any longer. But I really have in my heart, I think Father Murr said this the other day, our church is our mother, but she's been, in a sense, somehow, what do we say, mugged in a way, beaten up.
Going through a passion, like Benedict XVI said.
Yep. So if we really care about her, we need to take actions maybe we've never taken up till now, because we find her lying almost beaten up. In fact, my mother once in New Haven, Connecticut, at Yale University, had a handbag on her arm. And she was about to get into her car, and someone grabbed the handbag as he came by on a little motorcycle, and he dragged her 10 feet because she wouldn't let go, and she was all scraped. So it happened to my own mother, and she managed to grab the handbag, and I think the strap broke, and she didn't lose anything. But if our mother is all scraped, we don't abandon her, right?
Of course.
Absolutely right.
I'm not sure of the exact steps to take, but I know we've got hundreds of people watching. If they would make one visit to the parish priest and say, we are honored and respect the commitment you made at your ordination, if we can help in some way to heal the wounds of the church. I'm suggesting let's begin.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, before we wrap up, I just want to put these book covers on the screen. These are the two Fatima books that Chris Ferrara has written. Again, they're both available from the Fatima Center, actually in full PDF format. If you go to fatima.org and search the title, you will find the webpage on there. And these are two more books that Mr. Ferrara has written over the years. And these are both available from Angelico Press. I'll put a link in the live chat for those who might be interested in finding them on there. But the one on the left is The Great Façade, and it's really talks about what we've been talking about today, as he says, the regime of novelty in the Catholic Church from Vatican II to the Francis Revolution. And then the one on the right is going to be more germane to what we're going to talk about in our continuation on locals, which is really looking at more of the secular sphere, especially in light of the upcoming election in the United States. So I think with that, we will go ahead and end this live stream, and we will see, hopefully a lot of you will join us over on locals. I've put the link in the chat a few times so you know where to find us, and you just have to sign up and become a member of our community. There are different, different tiers of membership. You don't have to donate anything if you don't want to. You can just sign up and be a member and watch the show. But if you would like to become what's called a supporter and donate maybe $5, $8 a month to support our work, we would greatly appreciate that. And that opens up the possibility for you to participate in the live chat over there, a few other things. So as we wrap up here, we thank you all for joining us. and we look forward to seeing you on Locals. We will see you there shortly. God bless you and Godspeed.